So, on the note of not pretty, well, it's actually not so bad. Let's take a look at the internet weather for the last week or so here. And not a whole lot of new things here, just basically a progression of some of the previous reports that we had. First is scan sources and probes on port 32764 TCP. And this, again, as we've mentioned before, we're actually looking at the number of sources that are doing the probing. It's not increasing significantly. We certainly do have that activity taking place. And if you recall, this particular port is identified as a backdoor port that was identified in a variety of home router devices. This is, in fact, I think, if I understand correctly, the patches are available. Most systems probably, or devices probably have not been patched, but even with the patch, apparently the backdoor sort of still exists, but it's a little more hidden. So this is just yet another example of the Internet of Things that are not well devised to be connected to the internet and need to have better security controls around them. Next item here is scan and probes on port 7001 TCP. This is associated with Oracle WebLogic. But in any case, it's a specific source that's been probing on this port. We've been reporting on this for weeks. You can see sort of the regular cycle of probing activity. And, occasionally there's some other activity that's taking place here, but fundamentally, this particular source is, basically the originator of most of the activity. And it's also probing on a number of other ports that we've identified before. It's port 110, that's Pop3, 1433, that's Microsoft SQL database, 1521, that's Oracle database, 1723, which is a point-to-point protocol, tunneling protocol, that is, 3128, which is Squid proxy, 3306, which is MySQL database, so they like to go after databases here, and then 8081, that's HTTP proxy. So a number of ports that are being probed by this same source address on a variety of, perhaps looking for a variety of capabilities there.
It's interesting you point out there that there's another follow-up address that does the...
There is another address. It doesn't look directly associated. It may be associated. It's not in the same address block or anything like that, but it is also in China, and you're right. It is making connection attempts, and too many of them are successful to be by chance. And so it's got some basis of information that it's using to go. So it could be a follow-up connection activity that is taking place associated with that.
That actually reminds me of a well-known university here that does something similar. There's one IP address that scans for whatever it is they're looking for, and then they have a follow-on IP address that does the connection and additional probing.
Right. And generally, from the attacker's point of view, that's a more efficient way to do it. It also may provide a little bit more anonymity in the process. But all right, next item here is scan probes on port 7547 TCP. I think we've talked about this one before. It's associated with a protocol that's called CPE, that is Customer Premise Equipment WAN Management Protocol, WAN being Wide Area Network. It's actually documented in a document from the DSL form. I think it's Technical Report 69 or TR69. In any case, this is intended to be a protocol used for managing DSL modems effectively. There's actually an article about this that indicates that there are a number of vulnerabilities in some of the implementations that are potentially exploitable. Now, this particular scanning activity here actually is attributable to a particular United States university that apparently is, I'm going to say this is innocuous activity that we're detecting here. They're scanning around, identifying vulnerable devices, but I don't think it's for the purpose of exploit. I think it's for the purpose of conducting some research or studies around this. But that doesn't mean that others couldn't be doing that similar activity and potentially exploiting this. In any case, perhaps we'll get some more information about this as time goes on, hopefully reported in a responsible manner. Next item is of a similar ilk. different port, different activity clearly, but it's scan probes on port 502 TCP. This one happens to be associated with Modbus over TCP IP, Modbus being basically a function for industrial control systems. So we've heard a lot in the press about the potential of industrial control systems or control systems being exploitable, inclusive of manufacturing systems, water control or water filtration systems, those sorts of things. Again, this activity, and you can see that the similarity in the pattern from the previous one, activity from a U.S. university, I'm going to declare that as innocuous as a part of their research activities. That is, when I say innocuous, it does not appear to have malicious intent associated with it.
I just keep thinking, if you're going to hook up an industrial control system to the internet, don't.
Yeah.
Don't.
Yeah. I mean, clearly there should be protective controls around that. It should not be something that could be directly addressable from the internet. There should be firewalls around that, or at least, locally, at the very least, an IP change thing. So I'm only accepting from the addresses I expect to expect connections from, as opposed to allowing it to be accessible from the internet.
Or don't even make it apparent that this is an IP address that's even related to something like that. Require users to VPN or hop through several other systems to get to it. It's still internet facing to a degree, but it makes it much harder for a critical system to be exposed like this.
Absolutely. Very good point. Next item here is top 10 most probed ports, and we've been seeing this activity fairly consistently for the last several weeks here. Top one on the list, port 135 TCP. This is associated with some really kind of strange activity we've seen. Next item is 9064 TCP, which is a proxy port, and then followed by port 23 TCP and port 22 TCP. We talked about that password guessing activity, and it's certainly likely related to that. Followed by port 53 UDP. This can be either scanning for DNS servers, open DNS resolvers, or occasionally what can happen is it can look like reconnaissance activity if those DNS servers are being used in reflective denial of service attacks. Next one followed by 1900 UDP. Same explanation as port 53 UDP, looking for SSDP or Simple Service Discovery Protocol servers that can be used in those attacks. And next one, similar, port 123 UDP. That's Network Time Protocol, which is also used in the reflection attacks. So all of those are sort of grouped together here. And then that's followed by port 110 TCP, that's POP3, as we talked about earlier about a particular address as it was scanning on that particular port. There's other activity as well. And then followed by port 445 TCP, that's Conficker, and then 8080 TCP, often used for proxies. And so the search for anonymizing proxies goes on. Taking a little bit of a closer look at the Pop3 activity, that's port 110 TCP. Most scans, again, in this case, were from a U.S. university, and there are others contributing to this that are likely more nefarious in terms of their intent. You can see sort of the regular scanning activity, but as you can also see that recently we're looking at 90 days of activity, but in the last couple of weeks here, the density of that activity has increased significantly, hence the reason it showed up on our top 10 report. Next item here is the most sources doing that probing, and far and above the others is port 23 TCP, but the relative proportion of port 23 has gone down a little bit since our last recent reports. So we're going to take a little bit of a closer look at that to see what's going on with it. And some of the other ports here, we've mostly talked about those. We see BitTorrent showing up on here, a 1900 UDP, and there's clearly some ICMP activity showing up on here. But taking a little closer look at the port 23, and we're looking at the last 180 days. When I saw the proportion of activity going down a little bit, I thought, well, maybe this is that port 23 probing activity is going down a little bit as well, but it's not exactly the case. It looks like we're just sort of in a lull of activity here. What you can see is over the last few weeks, it looks like maybe a downward trend, but I wouldn't treat that as a downward trend per se. We're still seeing spikes, that is, increases in the number of sources that are doing the probing, which indicates that there's somebody with a botnet that's commanding those devices to do it. And I suspect that basically what they've done is gone into sort of a maintenance mode where they have some proportion of the exploited devices doing scanning activity and another proportion of those that are probably being used for other activities. And I would suspect that most of that is denial of service attack activity. So there's been a lot of discussion in the media about Lizard Squad stressors. There are a number of others that are out there, unfortunately, and as a consequence, they're going out and searching for devices to include as a part of their botnets. And last but not least here, I wanted to share with you the daily reconnaissance index. We haven't looked at this in several weeks, so we're looking at the last 400 days of activity, and basically there are two normalized contributions in this index. There's the number of probes that we see and the number of sources that we see doing the probing activity. And as you can see here, the activity's been sort of trending up over the last few months, and consistent with a lot of the reports that we've been bringing to you here. Part of it due to the Internet of Things, more probing activity associated with that, and the reflective denial of service attack activity can also contribute to this as well. And so that's a little bit of a disturbing trend. We like to see this in the stock market. We don't like to see it in the reconnaissance index.